Well, Broadway fans, he is a two-time Tony winner, bringing us classic Broadway shows like Big River, The Who's Tommy, Jersey Boys, and now he is back as a Tony nominee again for his work on Ain't Too Proud, The Life and Times of the Temptations. I'm Sam Eckmann from Gold Derby, and joining me is director Des McAnuff. Thank you so much for joining me, Des, and congrats on a very well-deserved 6th Tony nomination.
Thanks, Sam.
This is the season is the cherry on top of everything, but musicals take a really long time to make it to Broadway, and I think you've been working on this for around 5 years. Can you just talk about how you first got started with the show?
Sure. Ira Pittleman and Tom Hulse called me and our producers and invited me to meet with Otis Williams, which was, of course, impossible to refuse. But I will say I was somewhat cautious for a couple of reasons. We enjoyed substantial success on a little opus called Jersey Boys, which ran for a long time, I think more than 12 years ultimately on Broadway. And, I wanted to, I guess, be careful not to kind of try to compete with that. Mm-hmm. And also, I didn't know that much about the Temptations. I grew up in Toronto, and in fact, played music. I still play music, but when I was a teenager, I actually even played some of these songs. Everybody had to be in a band. If you wanted to date, you basically had to, pick up an electric guitar. So I played the songs. I'm very, very familiar with their body of work, but I knew very little about their history. I knew that David Ruffin had left the band. A couple of the big signposts were clear to me. But even though we were pretty close to Detroit and we loved the music from Detroit, I don't remember ever having discussions about the Temps. So I got to know his biography, read some articles, tried to educate myself a bit. And then when I met with Otis, it was clear that this was very, very important to him. He wanted to set the record straight. All the other guys had moved on. The classics were all dead except for Otis, and it was clear that this was important. He wanted to tell his story, and he asked me to do it at the first lunch that I met him. He asked me to do it, and when Otis Williams asks you to do something, you pay attention. He's 6'5". He's a very persuasive guy. He's he's rhythm and blues royalty. So, and obviously, I'm very glad that I said yes.
Well, that's quite a compliment that he asked you to do it. It's an incredible story of his, of how they made this band and everything they had to sacrifice. And his memoir was kind of the main source of inspiration. Was there something in particular that surprised you or grabbed you that you wanted to incorporate in the show as a story thread?
I think when I first met with him, and then later working with Dominique Morisseau, we met with Otis Williams and Shelley Berger, the Temptations manager. We met with them a couple of times, several times. And I guess at the first meeting, one of the things I was impressed by is just complete openness. He told me about the way Eddie had left the group. He told me about finding them all gathered around a pipe freebasing, at a hotel suite in David Ruffin's room. He was willing clearly to open a vein in order to tell this story. And then when, and certainly we drew on the biography. And Dominique, I want to say, growing up in Detroit, she has a magnificent ear for the dialogue in the piece, because it's part of her own history, and she knew the Temptations. She knew a different generation of Temptations because she's a little bit younger, but she certainly knew the music very well. So she already had her own kind of history. But I've got to say, the biography was important, but Otis and the anecdotes, and Shelley as well, that became extremely valuable, in terms of deep background and also just inspiration for telling the story.
Yeah. And in addition to Dominique's book, your other big collaborator here is Sergio Trujillo doing the choreography. And I'm always curious how, directors and choreographers work together, because he was really responsible for so much of the physical language of the show. So how do you make sure that you're both meshing while you're working together?
Well, first of all, I did a lot of work with Dominique in advance. And we basically sat together for many, many hours going through the music and creating an outline. So before Dominique started writing, we together had created a roadway, a pathway for this show, and the dramatic architecture that would become very important to all of our collaborators. And I actually did, right from the beginning, it was very clear that the story needed to be about an institution. The Temptations are more than just a group. They made a profound contribution to, the cultural times of the 60s, and during those turbulent political years. It was really about a line that comes from the play, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. There have been 24 temptations. So exits and entrances, and we specialized in those in the theater, that became our kind of stock and trade. And so when I first met with Dominique, I actually had I developed this idea of 2 turntables and a treadmill. And she, instead of leaving my office, she actually was kind enough to embrace those ideas physically. And we were able then to kind of picture the production as we went along. So by the time Sergio was invited into the process, there was a blueprint for the production numbers. And Robert Brill, the designer, and I have been working on obviously the scenographic design and so on. And so Sergio, from the very beginning, had I think a leg up, and in that the story had been developed. Sergio is a masterful storyteller himself, but he's also very generous. So I can't honestly remember even having had a strong disagreement during the whole period we've been working on this. And we started in earnest in Sergio and I in January of 17 with Kenny Seymour, who was our music director, and also Harold Wheeler, the great orchestrator. So when it came time to kind of plan the numbers, we also had, of course, our musical minds with us at the table. And it really is a collaboration, but Sergio and I have been working together for so long that a lot of it, I think, is almost telepathic. He's very responsive. If he thinks you have a vision for a show, he's not busy trying to do some parallel production. He jumps into the sandbox and starts building sandcastles. And he grew up in Colombia, or he was born in Colombia, I'm sorry, and I was born in Illinois, but we were both raised in Toronto. So I think there's some sort of strange, connection. We grew up in the suburbs of the same city. And again, I would say that Sergio is a playwright that doesn't use language to tell a story. He doesn't use words. He uses dance. And so he's a very, very big part of this production.
And you mentioned other parallel projects, and I know you have a lot going on. You were certainly, if this took 5 years, certainly doing other things simultaneously. So does that, do those other projects that happen simultaneously ever sort of feed and influence each other? Oops, I'm in the dark here. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. Okay.
No worries. Absolutely. And sometimes cross-pollination comes from unexpected places. we did Jersey Boys in 2004, so it's 15 years. And since Jersey Boys, I've actually done, my assistant Megan Dieterle was pointing out to me recently that I've actually done 27 productions. And a number of those have actually happily proliferated as well. In other words, I've done them more than once. And of those, only 3 are, biographical musicals like Jersey Boys and Ain't Too Proud. The other one is Summer. And the other plays and musicals I've done come from a whole array of different genres. I believe I've done 7 classical plays, 6 by, William Shakespeare, a couple of those with Christopher Plummer. So I've done, I think, 6 new plays, brand new scripts, and a number of musicals with brand new scores. I think I've done 6 of those, and as well as some classic musicals. And they all really do inform each other. And in a sense, the techniques you learn working with language and verse drama, let's say, are really useful when it comes to doing musicals, because there's a formality in the language. If you're dealing with iambic pentameter or trochaic tetrameter, there's rhythm and poetry in the language. Musicals are very, very concise. And there is poetry in Dominique Morisseau's script. And so the techniques are not all of that foreign. The biggest mistake, though, one can make as a director is when you think you know something and try to misapply it. And so it's important every time out to really look at the canvas as fresh and new. It's the technique that you develop for that particular play with the actors and the writers that's most valuable. It's the approaches you invent. And so I know it's a horrible cliche, but the more you know, the more that you recognize your own ignorance. And that's been my misfortune. So just when I thought I was kind of getting good at something, I would fall gloriously on my face and realize that I had nothing to be smug or cocky about. And then, you're constantly learning, constantly. And that's I guess the joy and the misery of what we do.
Well, one of the biggest poetic moments for me anyway in this show, with Derek Baskin as Otis Williams, he's narrating so much of this as the last surviving temptation. And he gets to the end where he's been in ensemble numbers, and he gets to the end after he said goodbye to these men who've become his brothers, and just unleashes into this magnificent solo number. What was it like kind of crafting that moment for that character?
Gee, Sam, that is a fantastic question. And thank you for asking that, because I think you're onto something that's really important about the journey we go on with Ain't Too Proud. Otis, as you say, is the last surviving member. And we use the imagery of a shepherd climbing a mountain, a kind of biblical imagery to talk to the Almighty. And that's the journey he goes on in this memory play. And so I think it's really important that Derek is able to kind of discover as he goes along. And so he asks the question, were the sacrifices worth it? Everybody else is gone. Were those sacrifices worth it? We talk a lot about gospel in the course of the play, but we actually never go there. All these guys grew up, all the members of the Temptations, in the South, and they grew up in the church. And that's where they first started practicing their art as singers. And they came to Detroit as part of that great migration that had to do with the automotive industry that lasted more than half a century. And so, but they all have those Southern roots. But we never play the gospel card in terms of the singing until the end of the journey. And it's at a moment of great pathos. Otis finally sacrifices more than he bargains on. and he hits a moment in his life where he really has to question whether it has been worth it. And he bursts gloriously to this gospel number. And Derek may well be the best singer in the company, but we don't let him sing solo very much at all. And one of the things he talks about, he goes through as a temptation, is he has to sacrifice his own individual ambitions to be part of this group. He's not going to be the lead singer. He's not going to be the songwriter. But when he gets to that moment at the end of the show, emotionally, the audience understands what he's given up for that group, because it's this moment of absolute virtuosity. And so it was very much intentional, and Dominique had an awful lot to do with, obviously, that story. And we saved that moment intentionally. We didn't go to gospel until that. And Kenny Seymour, our arranger, who, by the way, his dad was in Little Anthony and the Imperials, so he's pedigree himself. And he did that gospel arrangement in the room, in rehearsal, when we got there. And we all knew that we had struck a major vein of gold. So I'm very glad that you gave me the opportunity to talk about that particular bit of architecture.
Oh, well, it was a great moment. And, you know, the cast who's pulling this off, it's an impeccably cast show. We have 5 Black men leading a show, which is, you know, rare and awesome to have on Broadway. And 3 of them you've now directed to Tony nominations. What goes into actually casting this group when they are real life people? Is it a different sort of process than normal?
You know, I think on some level you have to embrace the idea that you're doing historical fiction. So if you try to cast lookalikes, you're probably limiting yourself too much. On the other hand, you know, you have to respect the fact that these are historical characters, and that there are people that have familiarity there. So you don't want to be, you know, completely oblivious to who the characters were. I think you can watch people transform. You know, I think Ephraim Sykes really is possessed by Ruffin. You know, he sings like him, he moves like him. As a person, Ephraim is an intellectual. He's very, I would say, poetic. I would call him a gentle person, and a very sophisticated, and he manages to just, you know, completely possess David Ruffin, and that has to do with talent, not the fact that he's a lookalike. Derek, interesting enough, is I would say Derek has a lot of great qualities. He's very charming. He's a very easy guy to be with, because he has this infectious charm. But he also has a brilliant sense of humor. So if somebody's going to tell you a story over a couple of hours and take you on a journey, even if it's Hamlet, the most important quality is that they have a sense of humor, because you don't want to spend 2 hours with anybody that's humorless, self-serious. I think, you know, the casting process in this show had to do with looking for, there are 21 of them altogether, triple threats in every role. And we have Tara Rubin as our casting director, and she worked tirelessly to make sure we were seeing everybody that could potentially play, you know, one of these parts. And we got down to the final dance call, and I think we literally had 30 people in the room. And one of the things that was very humbling about this process is we had to recognize the vast number of talented African-American men and women that are in our talent pool. And so I think this show's success has everything to do with this group of young actors, most of them in their 20s. This is a show for young people. And I want you know, I want the geezers like me to come out too. But, you know, and rock and rollers from the 70s and 80s and people that loved rhythm and blues and Motown in the 60s and 50s. But, you know, this, I think by and large is a show for young people. This is a show that's about today. This is a show that's about Black Lives Matter and the issues that are going on in our country now that have to do with race and conflict. And so this is and I tell you that young cast, they're winning an awful lot of fans with young people, and that's the most gratifying thing to me, is that this show's not about past. This is about now, and it's about future.
Well, I think that's great, and it's all come together in a really beautiful and profound way. So thank you for joining me, Des. Everyone watching at home, make sure you hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our coverage during Tony season. And Des, congrats again on your Tony nomination, and we'll cross our fingers for you in June.
Thanks, Sam. I really appreciate this. This was a great deal of fun. Thanks.
Well, thank you. It's great to meet you.